Appreciate everyone taking the time to join today. I am Ryan, the head of marketing at Cognia, and I'm joined by Ryan DeFreitas, who joined us about 8 or 9 months ago, having spent 11 years doing performance analysis with 9+ years at Leicester on the academy side, and as well as Manchester City. We've done a lot of work with a lot of academies around Europe and around the world, and how to implement a data analysis framework, process, culture. And we wanted to use today to share that and advise teams and give our insights across there, and use Ryan's expertise and experience there to help answer some of the questions we've had today. So that's what we'll try and do. We've broken it down into three sections. First, want to look at benchmarking and development. Then we'll go into that academy first team transition, and then we'll finish by looking at culture and working processes. So we'll get straight into it. So Ryan, I know you feel quite strongly about how benchmarking can improve an academy's processes. Could you just give us a little overview as to what you mean by that, and perhaps how that can be implemented?
Yeah, I guess why they're useful and what they are one and the same thing. It's simply a method of understanding what good is. You can collect data, but without something to compare to, it's difficult for you to actually contextualize whether a data profile is good or whether a level of performance is good, without understanding what the targets are they're striving to. In terms of how you can implement them, it's something is better than nothing. I always think it's have nothing is not almost inexcusable, but ideally you want it to be important to your club around the metrics and the playing style and the tactics that are important to your environment. But as I say, something is better than nothing. So even if it's just around comparing to your winger to the best wingers in the world, that's a good starting point, because it can be daunting to start from nowhere. But looking at what is accepted as good and comparing to there's a good starting point, and then starting to progress into, well, this might be what a good winger is in general. What does a good winger look like for our environment? What profile of winger do we actually want? Because I'm sure everyone would like a Messi or a Lamine Yamal in their club, but that might not necessarily match the playing style of the club. That might not necessarily match the aspirations of the club. So there's a significantly difference between what is good and what's elite in general, and what is good for your club and what your targets are.
And if you are looking at I don't know, say 14-year-old or 16-year-old in that elite winger category, how would you approach that from a benchmarking perspective? Would it be looking at first team data? Would it be looking at A teams or the same age group? How would you go around approaching that?
I mean, there's different ways of doing it, and you've almost said it yourself. So I think you probably need smaller steps initially. But as I say, it's difficult to start from nowhere if you've got no benchmarking. So it's quite easy to access first team data. So that might be a good starting point. And then you can start to break those down into smaller steps as you move through that process. Understood.
And I guess with academies, you've got potentially an 8-year-old in an academy, and you've got an 18-year-old in an academy. And 8-year-olds and 18-year-olds aren't the same. And not everybody develops at the same rate. So how do you manage that from a data perspective, in terms of a late developer, for example? How would you sort of manage that, from whether it's benchmarking or whether it's how you analyze the player?
I mean, it's a good example of describing that old adage of data is never going to be black and white, never going to be the be all and end all. I think it's important that you always have experts in the room to be able to contextualize that information. So I don't think you're ever going to get away from using the experts in the organization, whether it be your sports scientists or whether it be your medical staff, even your parent liaisons. They've all got good information around the players, how long they've been at the club, what their journey's been like across the club, what difficulty they've had. Your medical department's going to understand their medical history. So you really need those experts in the room to be able to contextualize the whole player, rather than just saying this is the data and we make decisions off of that. There's different benchmarking methods though. For the younger age groups, I think it's important you look at volume of action, because the success of a young player is not really that important. No one remembers if they won on the weekend or if they won last month or even if they won last year. The end point is obviously to make first team players. So we just want players to access the opportunities to perform actions. And then obviously as they go down the development pathway, they're starting to think more about successful performance. And therefore, naturally, your benchmarking process looks more to success. The metrics don't even need to change, but we want our players to then be able to perform successfully so they can go and perform in our first team or in another first team elsewhere.
And if you were running a club or running an academy, when would you look to be making that transition from the more volume-based approach to success? When do you think is the right time? And I appreciate I'm putting you on the spot here.
Yeah. I mean, scholarship age group is probably where performance becomes more important, but I think it's drip fed across the whole journey. You obviously don't need to look at it for under 8s and under 9s. They're just trying to enjoy football, and we want to ensure that they're accessing those opportunities. But you can start to look at, are they successful? You can start to use those sort of markers to say, we might have a talented player that we might push forward, maybe go up age groups if they're successful in their age group, to give them more appropriate challenge. So it's difficult to say there's one point in time. I would certainly have an eye on it, even if it's just in the background as a practitioner, to have an idea of what a player is able to do and how successfully.
Got it. And are there any particular metrics, insights that you would think, yeah, that's a good one that's really helpful in terms of, I don't know, a young midfielder in terms of the volume there, but actually when they get to 16 plus, there might be something different. Have you got anything there that you might specifically, hypothetically look out for or want to choose within your benchmarks and measurements?
I think it's very player dependent. And this is why it's so important to have these experts in the room and to understand the whole player. Some players might be, we would say, physically maxed out, might be a terminology used in some clubs, and therefore certain development in certain metrics might not be possible. So therefore, although it might be a weakness, you might have to accept that that's always a weakness in the player or a development area in the player. It's difficult to say weakness with young players because who knows? And therefore, can you look at developing strengths? And obviously that differs between position, and that, as I've mentioned, can differ from player to player and certainly young player to young player.
Got it, mate. Got it. And then we've obviously spoken about the potential late developer, but what about the perhaps some younger players start earlier? How does that is it the same approach to split, or do you have to look at it differently?
I think you have to provide appropriate challenge. Like, I think you need to give them varied experiences as well. So in the same way you'd give an early maturer, the same way you might give a late maturer some opportunities to play against some younger aged players that are maybe less further down the maturity pathway, you might do the opposite for someone that's early mature. And maybe you put them up in age group in order to give them access to struggling as well as just striving as they probably would do in their age group due to that maturity difference.
Nice. And one thing I wanted to touch on was something you were telling me about when you were back on the club side, was some of the sort of the training type games you used as well to help better benchmark players, and what you were doing in training and how you were capturing that.
Yeah, so this is how we sort of tried to answer the questions around biobanding, which about 10 years ago was a massive buzzword and everyone was trying to get into biobanding. And if you weren't biobanding, you were behind everyone else. The way I see it, it's just another way of presenting a player a challenge. And there's obviously different ways to do that. Biobanding is one of them. So we use something we call tech assessments, which was pioneered by Matt Goodwin at Leicester. And I sort of took that in my stride and went running with it and made it something even bigger. So we had good foundations at Leicester anyway. I think it's important to note that. We manipulated games essentially so that all players had the same challenge throughout the game. 4v4 games, 4 positions. Every player played each position for the same amount of time. And the theory being, because they all had the same challenge, you could compare players' technical ability without the additional construct of position. And through that, you will find out where they are particularly strong and also where their development areas are. As I say, because we had manipulated those game situations and we made each player's performance more comparable. Comparing a centre-half to a winger from a 90-minute match day is obviously, it's inappropriate. But comparing a young player who's played 4 positions for the same amount of time, it makes it more appropriate and more comparable. So we did that via age group. because I think it's important you understand how players perform in their age group. A small under-maturated player has every chance of still being a small player when they're fully maturated and they're a pro. So they still need to be able to perform in those environments. But as I say, biobanding was the big buzzword, and it is important as well. So we also did those tests, those assessments in biobanded groups. So players were having those same challenges, but against players that were of the same biobanding, which gave similar results. Sometimes there were some different results that came up because players were able to level the playing field physically. So it just gave an additional spectrum. It was good though, the players loved it. It was games, like every player wants to play games in training. But also we gave them a small level of understanding of what it was being done for, and it actually created a real culture of development. They wanted to be better than they were in the last assessment. They understood that it was going up against players in their age group and in their bioband, but that wasn't the deciding factor of whether they were a good or bad player.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. And I think one of the things you touched on there in terms of those four-a-side type games and moving players around positions, and I imagine that players moving positions at age group football is quite common. And how does that impact how you analyse a player from a data perspective, knowing that they might have had a game at right wing or centre half, centre forward, and still making sure the data captures an accurate picture of that player?
Sure. So I had the luxury of being at Leicester for a long time. As you mentioned, I was there for 9 years. So I saw players go from under 9 all the way through to 18s. What that means is we could create a big sample size. So it wasn't necessarily a big problem for us to separate their profiles by position. So we did have players that played in multiple positions. Generally, they were fairly relative, like there might be a fullback and a winger and maybe a centre midfielder. So some of the challenges were similar, but we separated those out so we could have a full understanding of how those players performed in those positions and the actions they were involving themselves in, and maybe some of the actions they weren't involving themselves in.
Nice, thank you. And then we're gonna move on a little bit now, look at that academy first team transition piece, and I wanted to get your thoughts and from your experience, your take, what metrics, what insights, what data points align well in terms of that. Yeah, if they do this well, if it looks good at academy or look good at first team, or what the game looks like as a whole, and how you approach that.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I always go back to the first point of metrics you're looking at should be relative to your environment. You should pick out the things that are important for your game model, for the way you see that players should develop. Now, what's interesting is I've been looking at ball and play times recently, and it seems like there are differences between first team football and academy football. What the mechanisms are behind that, who knows? Like it's quite a small sample size in terms of the academy games I've looked at, but it seems like there's a lot more shorter possession sequences at academy football and some longer ones at first team, rather than those short bursts on average. And now that obviously would vary between the level of football you're looking at. For more vertical, maybe lower league football, those sequences might be smaller as well. I've just been looking at the top end of football. But what it does, it raises questions around the inherent differences in the games. Now, is that because the games are often manipulated at academy level for the benefit of players' development? Players are set specific targets. They have to try and hit those targets in game. They might be set up in different tactical methods, whereas you could suggest that first team is a bit more standardized in terms of from 1 week to the next, they'll play a similar formation. They might play a similar way, maybe with some tweaks to deal with the opposition. Smaller pitches, less experienced players, all reasons why these possession sequence could be shorter. But there's the saying of train for the way you want to play. But it seems like the way that they're playing those different age groups are different. So I guess it would have consequences for the way we train players, the way we manipulate games and training to ensure that the demands are similar from what they train to what they play, but then also what they play at those younger age groups towards what they play at those higher age groups as well.
Got it. So it's almost a case of you could, whether it's the higher academy ages or whether it's first team, analysing the game patterns, and then taking the metrics that perhaps are most different from academy, and how do you sort of bridge that gap from your academy side. So whether it's, as you said, sort of keeping the ball for longer periods, whether that's an intensity thing, whether that's a technique thing, and that's, I guess, your job as the analyst to go and turn into insights and sort of interventions to make, to prepare those players.
For sure. I mean, ideally it would be a linear process, right? possession seekers would slowly get longer and longer, so that there's an ideal progression through the pathway. But that's just not the case. So I guess, how can we give players, and how can we monitor the performance of those players to ensure that we can take into account those factors? And as I say, maybe we manipulate certain games less, maybe we do it more, but I think for sure there should be a way of making the game look a bit more similar at the younger age groups than it does at first team, and therefore that would have consequences for your data collection as well. Even if you keep the same process all the way through, you still need to have in your mind that these differences do exist. And then that takes us back to the point of, you have the expert voices in the room to contextualize that information when you do go into those review points for those players and discuss players and ultimately make big decisions on their lives.
Understood. Appreciate that. And back to the point of, I guess, progression not necessarily being linear. We don't live in a perfect world. And I understand your dissertation, when you for your master's, sort of spoke to this in terms of player profiling and age groups. Could you share a bit more about this, please?
Yeah, sure. So I was at the club when I did my master's. So across the whole time at the club, we wanted to understand longer player journeys. So we wanted to understand, how did a player go from under 9s through to under 16s, through to get a scholarship? How do they become a pro? At different points in their maturation, how did their performance change due to PHV? All the different contexts. Because I was there for such a long time, we were trying to understand those bigger questions, not just how did a player play over these 6 weeks and what was good and what was bad. We were trying to get into some real deep specific pointers around that. So I was looking at the demands on players at different age groups. So how involved the players at 16s, 18s, 23s, first teams, to try and understand whether there are similarities or difference across this pathway. Looking at involvements in playing and passing profiles, and the differences were just insurmountable. There were so many. At under 16, you had the centre halves who were more involved than any other position in the game, and then that would bounce around across the age groups. The next was the first team, and then the 18s and 23s weren't involved in the game whatsoever. Less, obviously, they were get involved in the game, but then that might change for line breaking passes, or the differences were different. The differences were different consistently, if that makes sense. So yeah, there was definitely crazy differences across the pathway, which obviously has implications for development and has implications for the data you want to collect. So as we say, there was no linear progression, which makes it difficult to really put in interventions and development pathways for these players, because you have to understand that at different places across the pathway, they are going to have to perform differently.
Understood. And I think we were chatting about this earlier in terms of, with their progression and intervention plans, you've got your benchmarking strategy, you've got your benchmarking process, and you've got a decision to make, I guess, as one of the stakeholders in a club, around whether you would, if a player is performing well in 4 out of 10 of your chosen metrics, what do you do with the other 6? Do you try and get a well-rounded player, or do you try and get someone who excels at those 4? And perhaps there is a sort of outer level of that benchmarking for what elite might truly look like. I wanted to sort of get your take there.
Yeah, sure. It kind of alludes to what I was speaking to earlier. It depends on the profile of the player, and that depends on the experts that are analysing that player. Some are probably going to be capable of being well-rounded. You've got some players that have inherent limitations to what they will be able to do in the future. There was a move towards not pigeonholing players into certain positions, but sometimes you can see with young players, they might only ever play 1 or 2 positions. So you can start to highlight what's important for that player. I've seen that as young as under 11 and under 12, where they were only going to be a centre half, and lo and behold, they're a centre half. So are you doing that player a disservice by putting them in 1v1 duels in wide areas, whereas you could be focusing their development? That's up for debate. Some people will say, yes, you should do that, because you never know. Some will say, no, let's give that player the best chance of being a first team player when they're older.
Yeah, I guess you hear a lot of stories, sort of probably from a bit further back than today, in terms of when they're younger, the player starts centre forward, they then move to wing, midfield, defence, and before you know it, they're playing fullback as such. And I imagine now it's obviously slightly different with the roles of different positions and different players, but I'd imagine sort of having a benchmarking process can help inform, or at least give a better insight of where that player might end up?
Well, I mean, even if you do play these players all over the pitch, if you've got benchmarking, you can compare their performance to the benchmarks. And then as they age, you can start to see, okay, this player looks like this profile of player. And then you can start maybe moving them towards, you can still give them opportunities in other positions. There's still some value of playing a centre-back in midfield because of the challenges of receiving under pressure, playing in different directions, just not always forward. We know the game's become more of a build-up game, so they are going to have to play with the receiving with striker pressure. So there is still value, but at least you've got an eye on, through benchmarks, this player probably looks like they might end up in these certain positions. Or maybe you do it the other way. Maybe it's able to discount. We know this player is never going to be a left winger because he's a big, strong lad who's right-footed, and if we always want our left winger to go around the outside and cross, it's just not going to be a possibility for that player. But how do you really know without benchmarks? That's what I say. How do you know what's good? I always say that. How do you know what's good with your data? Anyone who speaks to me who hasn't got benchmarks, this player has 70% duels and we think it's great. Well, how do you know? Because you've got nothing to compare it to. I think benchmarks just asking so many different questions across the whole pathway.
Excellent. Thank you. And I think one of the things we spoke about as well was around really capturing that sort of longitudinal journey, if you will. You might have players in the building from 10 years old, and then if they, have a long first-team career, obviously you're at Leicester for a long time, at the same time when I guess data was becoming more prevalent and commonplace in clubs. How does that look to your ideal world, I guess, in the first instance, having that mapped out journey and that full sample?
Yeah, I think it's great because it gives you those periods of time to understand that some players go through a PHV and their performance is probably going to drop off, both in terms of volume and success, because these players are unable to move their body in the way they used to and the way they're going to be able to once they come out of those phases. It gives you a good opportunity to highlight where these things happen, and then you can take that into the contextual information when you discuss players. And if you've got benchmarks that fit to your game model and you fit to your development model of certain positions, you can understand how those performances change in direct comparison to what you believe is important. And if you can have a data profile of a player where they're young, where they're maybe successful and they get involved a lot and you think it looks great, it'll also probably it will give that player a bit more time when it comes to decisions, if maybe they are struggling across those PHV years, and give them more chance of being in the building and being a pro.
Got it. And if, for example, I say we're hypothetically looking at a striker, let's say, and then I guess knowing what that might look like post sort of, after the fact in terms of when they're 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, even 35 to a degree. And I guess mapping out what success looks like at that level, whether it's a particular curve, and being able to identify perhaps particular tactical insights, particular metrics that you might want to keep an eye out for, or might want to be more prominent in your benchmarking and evolve that as such.
Exactly. So at Leicester, we had an idea of what a player's profile had to look like in order to get through to the next level, so to speak. So we had statistically different metrics that we knew. Players that got a scholar and didn't get a scholar, we knew the difference between those players. So therefore, we had a real clear idea of how to get players through the pathway. So we had at each level, we knew how to get through players from foundation to YDP, from YDP to scholar, from scholar to pro pro contract. And that obviously it takes time to generate, but as I say, I was there for a long time. We had the luxury of doing so. So we had the statistically different metrics. We knew that was there. We also had a level of subjectivity to it as well, because it's important. We surveyed the first team staff. What do they believe players in certain positions need to do? We had highly experienced staff in the academy as well. We were kind of fortunate that when we went to the first team and said, look, this is what we've noticed is statistically different, they were some of the fundamentals of the game. So they were in agreement, yes, we need our players to do that. And similar as well with the academy staff. But I think because we broke it down, the main aim of the academy was to create first team players. But if you look at an under 9 and say, okay, we're going to make a first team player out of that, it can just feel entirely insurmountable. They've got another 10 years to develop before you can get there. But those smaller steps make it easier to compare players against what you feel is an ideal profile. and then evaluating that in a specific process is important as well.
And then we spoke briefly about almost the, and it's worth addressing, is the sort of potential pitfalls of that as well. In terms of, I'll leave you to sort of rather than criticise your own work in front of everyone, I'll leave you to talk about the pitfalls there.
It's self-fulfilling, isn't it? I mean, we had statistically different. Let's assume we have these statistically significant metrics, and we only give player scholars who achieve well in those metrics. Then that's only going to improve or make it less good the benchmarks, right? It's going to keep saying that those benchmarks need to get higher and higher. You don't get a scholar without meeting the benchmark on those metrics. So it continually fulfills itself. You'll only ever take that kind of player. You pigeonhole yourself into have players of that profile. So that's a limitation, because, as I say, you will never take any player different. And in 5 years' time, your first team might be playing a completely different style. That's no longer appropriate. Your benchmarks are for one type of player. Well, now we don't know how to evaluate players for the new environment. So it's a limitation in that sense. We took it as, there is positives though. It gives a clear focus on how we discuss players, how we make decisions, and gives you a bit more of a black and white, obviously with contextualization, process to make decisions on players and how they develop, and then ultimately how they move through the pathway.
Got it. And have you ever had or been confronted with a situation where you want to make an academy player a first team ready player? That's the goal. But I guess in a world where so many players now have specific roles, or they are a specific position, that you're ultimately unsure of where they'll land, but they're actually, from your work, they're a good performer across a lot of things, but they're just I don't want to say a good player, they're all good players, but in terms of just not knowing exactly where or how, and being able to communicate that and sharing that, is that a sort of common situation? Is that something you found yourself in?
I've had situations, maybe this will answer your question, you can stop me if it's not. I've had situations where data has, for want of another word, saved a player from release from an academy. This player was up for release due to not even necessarily football terms. They were well thought of. But they had some psychological issues, social issues in and around the group, also home life as well. But through data and benchmarks, which is the big key word, I was able to show how proficient they were technically to keep them in the building for another release cycle, which is another 2 years. And through that, they are now a very, very good pro and a very, very good player. Now that's just one specific example of where we managed to use data to get a good outcome compared to the bad outcome we might have had. It's important that you do review the process. I've also had a situation where we released a player and my data agreed with it because technically, tactically, they didn't meet our benchmarks. Now, some might say, well, then that just proves that data isn't the be all and end all. I don't think it comes down to data in isolation. What it comes down to is your process. You use data in your process to make better informed decisions. And then when you make these right and wrong decisions, you review the process itself rather than the decision itself and the outcome. And I think if you set a process and you stick to it, you can say, we made a wrong decision, but we know we stuck to our beliefs and our processes. We made the steps that we always make, and we came to that decision the same way. And then you just have to accept that whatever system you use, you're going to make some right and wrong decisions. Ultimately, player development is a level of crystal ball thinking. You're trying to look into the future, and whatever you do, you're going to make some wrong decisions. I just fully believe that having a data collection and benchmarking that data across your development pathway, you give yourself the opportunity to minimize those wrong decisions, and you're going to make more informed decisions. That's just, you can't argue with me with that.
Thank you. No, that's really insightful there. And I think we're going to jump into our final section, which is around culture, working practices, and implementation. And I think one of the things you spoke about earlier was in terms of joules and increasing percentages. But I know we spoke about what that might look like in reality in terms of communicating with a player, with a coach. It wouldn't be a case of your joules need to go from 64% to 82%, for example. What would that? That's obviously the starting point, but what does that look like from your perspective there, someone who's working with the data and also the coaches and communicating with the players?
Yeah, I think you have to speak in the language of the stakeholder. Like if you're speaking to a player, you're going to speak to them completely different to when I've spoken to directors of football in the past. They have a different understanding of football and of the terminology around data, because they have a different access to data. They also have different wants and needs. The players wants to get better themselves. A director of football wants to evaluate the whole team. Are we playing the way we want to play? So you need to present them with the information that's important to them, and you need to speak to them in the way they understand. The language of the organization is massive. I found that difficult when I moved from club to clubs at time. You still get stuck in your ways. Like, it was Leicester for so long, and they use certain terminology, and then you go and speak to Pep and use that same terminology, and he's a little bit like, what do you mean? Even though he's like the expert in football, the ultimate expert in football, it just demonstrates how important, even if you're speaking with someone who knows football inside out, they still have a language that they speak, and you need to make the effort to speak that language. And then if we think about differences between players, coaches, directors, I don't necessarily believe in being very direct with players around data. I think there's some you can give a certain insight to, but if you tell a player we need to get your 1v1 duels to a level of success from 70 to 90, it's all well and good, but they don't understand what does that mean exactly. Do they need to change the way they approach these duels? Do they need to change their body shape in duels? Do they need to change the pitch area where they're engaging in those duels? That can be done with words, but I think it's more powerful to do it with video. And then you've got coaches who are probably a bit of both, and then directors really are not that interested in video, in my experience. The board of directors prefer reports where you can objectify everything, and they can have a real clear idea of, yes, we've met our targets in these things, no, we haven't in these things, and what interventions do we put in place to rectify that. And lo and behold, if you've got benchmarks, directors want benchmarks. They want to know, are we good? Are we not good? And then only benchmarks can answer that.
Got it. And the last question we'll wrap up with is around, we spoke about getting ideas across, and almost just if you've got an inkling of something, or if you've got this belief of something, how you've approached that, and what you sort of do, whether it's to implement as part of that data culture, as part of that, I don't know, player development, whatever the area might be, how you've gone about that is quite like the story you've got here.
Yeah, I think everyone has good ideas. Everyone has a manager, and a manager loves to say no because of different things. Maybe it's budget, maybe it's time, maybe we haven't got the head count. But I genuinely believe if you believe something will make a difference and you get a no, then you should just do it anyway, and you drive it with the people that can help you make that difference. Now, if you want to spend 30 grand and the company says you haven't got 30 grand, well, that's a bit different. But if you think that coding a player's scanning in a game is going to make a difference to their development, because you have an understanding of where they do it, where they don't, the situations that they do and don't, and you're told no, you've got the means to do that anyway. You might have to eat up into your own time a little bit, but if you fully believe that it's going to make a difference, then you continue to drive it. And I guarantee you'll find someone in the organization who does value it. And what you'll do is eventually it will come out as being incredibly valuable. So when I moved to Man City, the first thing I did was collect a lot of player data in training. Now, it wasn't used for a long period of time, but I fully believe that having insight through data into player performance makes a difference. And then eventually that started to drive the player profiling process of players in game, which they didn't have at Man City. And then we were able to marry up player profiles in training. So what do players do in training that's going to help them perform successfully in matches? And we're able to objectify that information to then start to be able to influence player training prescription. And then that then also fed into the player development process. They had a big push on IDPs for players, learning plans. And then because I had this big sample size of information around players and what they do in training, it wasn't just, well, this player does this in games, we need to make sure he does better. It was also, they'd give them the opportunities they'd already had to develop in training. How many times have they been given individual learning opportunities in training to develop these scenarios? So we were able to hit the ground running in that process, rather than having a 6-12 month period where we had to collect the data again to really be able to inform that. So I believed in it. I knew it would make a difference. Took my own time to do it. And yes, it was hard work, but eventually it was valuable to the company. So my advice is just like, if you have an idea, innovate and just do it. Don't let people hold you back.
I think that training piece as well has come up a few times when we've spoken, and I know a few clubs have been speaking to us about how we can better capture that and how we can help inform. And I think, as you say, that, you know, if you're training X number of times a week compared to matches where it's only one a week, I think that's probably where a huge piece lies in terms of being able to have that more information and finding out more about your players, especially at the younger age.